Charleston, 1844. A city of high society and low morality, built on the backs of the broken and the blood of the forgotten. It was a place where the soil held secrets too heavy for the earth to swallow. On the night of October 23rd, the air turned gray with a fog so thick it felt like a shroud. That night, 5 men, the architects of 1,000 miseries, walked into a windowless, locked room at the Wellington Club. They were the masters of all they surveyed. But by midnight, the room was empty. The door was still bolted from the inside. The lamps were still burning. Their cigars were still smoking. They hadn't just left, they had been erased, leaving behind only a single jagged word carved into mahogany and 147 tally marks that bled with the truth they tried to bury. This isn't just a disappearance. It's a reckoning, Gemini said. The disappearance began not with a scream, but with the haunting click of a brass bolt sliding home. At exactly 8:03 p.m., the 5 most powerful men in the region sealed themselves inside Private Chamber 3, a room specifically engineered for the highest level of confidentiality. This was no ordinary parlor. Its walls were reinforced with thick, sound-absorbing velvet, and its single mahogany door was a fortress of privacy. There were no other exits, no service hatches, and the only window had been painted shut for decades, creating a tomb-like atmosphere of absolute isolation. For over an hour, the muffled rhythm of their voices drifted into the hallway, suggesting a debate of immense gravity and tension. The club staff went about their duties, unaware that they were witnessing the final moments of 5 local dynasties. By 9:17 p.m., the voices stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight. When the manager and the locksmith finally breached the room hours later, they expected to find a heated caucus or perhaps a tragedy. Instead, they were greeted by the chilling sight of an empty stage where the actors had simply dissolved into the air. The room was perfectly illuminated by 5 oil lamps that continued to burn with steady, unblinking flames, casting long shadows across the velvet. The air was thick with the scent of expensive tobacco and aged brandy, yet the men who carried those scents were gone. 5 chairs remained pushed back at various angles, as if the occupants had stood up in a moment of collective realization or sudden fear. The glasses of brandy sat on the table, shimmering under the lamplight, mostly full and undisturbed by any sign of a struggle. It was as if the men had been plucked from their seats by an invisible hand. The most terrifying detail was the single cigar belonging to Colonel Hartley, which sat perched on the edge of a crystal ashtray. Unlike the others that had long since crumbled into cold mounds of white ash, this one was still actively smoldering. A thin, delicate ribbon of blue smoke spiraled toward the ceiling, proving that someone had drawn breath through the tobacco within the last few minutes. This physical impossibility sent a shiver through the investigators, as the door had been locked from the inside until the very second they entered. There was no fireplace for a man to climb, no loose floorboards to hide a trapdoor, and no space behind the curtains. The physics of the room dictated that the men must be there, yet the evidence of their eyes screamed otherwise. The smoldering ember served as a timer, ticking away the seconds since a human presence had vanished. As the authorities began a frantic search of the perimeter, the structural integrity of the room became the focus of intense, bewildered scrutiny. Every inch of the hardwood floor was hammered and tested for hollow echoes, but the foundation of the Wellington Club remained stubbornly solid. The ceiling was a seamless expanse of decorative plaster, showing no cracks or signs of recent repair that could hide a secret exit. Even the window was inspected by a forensic expert who confirmed the ancient layers of paint were entirely undisturbed and brittle. This was a true locked-room paradox, a vacuum of human existence where the laws of nature seemed to have been suspended. The men had not walked out, for the porter had been stationed at the only exit to the building. They had not jumped, and they certainly had not hidden within the confines of the small, sparse chamber. The psychological impact on the witnesses was immediate and profound, as they realized they were standing in a place where logic had failed. Henry Webb, the man who had tracked their arrival, could only stare at the empty chairs with a look of hollow-eyed disbelief. He had heard the lock engage with his own ears and had stood watch in the hallway, yet no one had passed him. The locksmith, a man of cold iron and gears, found no evidence of tampering or duplicate keys that could explain a secret departure. The room felt wrong to those who entered it, not because of what was there, but because of the haunting resonance of what was missing. It was as if the 5 plantation owners had been edited out of reality, leaving their worldly possessions behind. The silence of the room was no longer just an absence of sound. It was a loud, screaming mystery. In the center of this impossible void sat the mahogany table, bearing the only message the vanished men would ever leave behind. The word reckoning was carved so deeply into the wood that the splinters were still sharp and the grain was still pale. It was a jagged, angry scar across the polished surface, a stark contrast to the refined surroundings of the elite gentlemen's club. Beside the word sat the pocket watches and gloves of the missing, objects of status now rendered utterly useless. The investigation would spend years trying to find a rational path out of that room, but every lead ended at the same locked door. The first keynote of this mystery remains the most chilling. 5 men went into the dark to hide their secrets, but the dark took them instead. They left a smoldering cigar and a legacy of blood, vanishing into a night that offered no answers. The investigation into the void left behind in the Wellington Club eventually drifted toward the salt-sprayed docks of the Charleston harbor. There, the name of a phantom vessel began to surface in the hushed whispers of sailors and the frantic scribblings of the missing men's journals, the Meridian. In March of 1844, this ship had slipped into the port under a veil of gray Atlantic mist, carrying a cargo that was never meant to be spoken of. While its official manifest claimed a mundane haul of tobacco and cotton, the ship's true purpose was far more sinister and lucrative. The 5 plantation owners had pooled their vast fortunes to finance a final, desperate gamble on the illegal international slave trade. They sought to bypass the ban that had been in place for decades, believing their influence could shield them from the law. However, the sea is a fickle partner for those who trade in human suffering, and the Meridian did not return as the triumphant vessel they had envisioned. When the ship finally groaned against the wooden piers of the harbor, it sat suspiciously low in the water, yet its hold was hauntingly silent. The captain, a man whose soul seemed as weathered and cracked as the ship's hull, refused to look the investors in the eye. Of the 147 men, women, and children who had been shackled in the dark of the lower decks, not a single soul remained to be sold. The investors were met not with the profit they craved, but with a terrifying void and a crew that looked as though they had seen the end of the world. Rumors swirled like debris in a storm, suggesting a catastrophic event had occurred during the crossing that necessitated a mass disposal. Whether it was a plague, a frantic attempt to outrun a naval patrol, or something far more macabre, the result was the same. The 147 souls had been surrendered to the crushing depths of the Atlantic, their voices silenced by the salt and the tide. The 5 men, terrified of the legal gallows and the ruin of their social standing, moved quickly to bury the truth under a mountain of gold. They paid the surviving crew members handsomely to vanish into the coastal wilderness, ensuring that the logs were burned and the manifest was doctored. They believed that by scrubbing the Meridian from the official records, they could erase the stain of the 147 murders from their own consciences. For a few months, the plan seemed to work, and the elite of Charleston continued to bow to the men who walked the streets as pillars of the community. But as the humidity of the South Carolina summer broke into the chill of autumn, the silence of the sea began to fail. The men started receiving messages, sometimes a single name on a scrap of wet parchment, sometimes a tally mark scratched into their front doors. They had tried to drown their sins, but the dead were proving to be remarkably buoyant, rising from the deep to haunt their every waking hour. Richard Ashby's private records revealed the true depth of the horror, as his meticulous nature forced him to document the very thing he feared. Hidden within his leather-bound volumes was a list of names, each one representing a life that had been extinguished during that cursed March voyage. He had written them down perhaps as a ledger of loss, or perhaps as a way to quantify the ghosts that had begun to crowd his study at night. The dates of the ship's arrival and the subsequent disappearance of the crew aligned perfectly with the onset of the men's collective madness. They weren't just losing their minds, they were being systematically hunted by the memory of what they had sanctioned on the high seas. The Meridian became a focal point of the constable's investigation, a ghost ship that carried no physical evidence but possessed a weight that crushed the men. Every mention of the vessel in their letters was laced with a palpable dread, as if the ship itself was a portal to their doom. The tragedy of the 147 souls was not merely a financial loss for the planters, but a moral anchor that was dragging them toward a dark, inevitable tide. William Foster's final journal entries spoke of a cargo that refused to remain in the depths, claiming he could hear the sound of iron chains rattling against the floorboards of his bedroom. He described the faces of those lost in March appearing in the reflection of his window, their eyes filled with the cold, silent judgment of the drowned. The others shared this vision, a communal haunting that suggested the 147 were not just dead, but were actively seeking a bridge back to the world of the living. This was the arrangement they had met at the Wellington Club to discuss, a way to stop the voices, to pay a debt that could not be settled with currency. They were 5 men who had built empires on the idea that people were property, only to find that the spirit of a human being cannot be owned or discarded. By the time they entered Private Chamber 3 on that fateful October night, the Meridian was no longer just a ship. It was a ghost that had finally come to port. The 147 tally marks found carved into the table were a direct echo of the lives lost during that illegal crossing, a physical manifestation of a spiritual debt. Each mark represented a person who had been denied a grave, and now they had claimed the lives of the men who had denied them their humanity. The second keynote of this mystery reveals that the disappearance was not a random act of fate, but a calculated response to a horrific crime. The sea had indeed given up its dead, and the 147 souls had traveled from the African coast to a locked room in Charleston to collect their due. The 5 owners thought they were the masters of the Atlantic, but the Meridian proved that some crimes are so heavy they can sink even the most powerful men. Gemini said. The mahogany table in the center of the room became a silent witness to a crime that transcended the physical world. Where there had once been a polished, pristine surface reflecting the glow of expensive lamps, there was now a battlefield of wood and splinters. The single word reckoning was not merely carved. It was gouged into the heart of the table with a violence that suggested supernatural strength. Each letter was deep and jagged, the raw, pale wood standing out against the dark finish like a fresh wound. The word served as a title for the horror that had unfolded, a declaration that the time for hiding behind wealth had ended. It was a blunt, uncompromising message left for the living, announcing that a trial had finally reached its verdict. The carving was so fresh that the scent of disturbed mahogany still hung in the air, mixing with the fading smoke of the cigars. Beneath that singular, terrifying word lay the true scale of the disappearance, a sea of 147 tally marks. These were not the elegant marks of a scholar, but the desperate, frantic scores of someone or something keeping a precise count of souls. They were clustered in groups, covering nearly 2 feet of the table's surface in a rhythmic, terrifying pattern of judgment. Each stroke of the blade represented a life that had been treated as a line on a ledger, now reclaiming its place in the physical world. The investigators counted them once, then twice, their hands trembling as the number 147 began to resonate with the rumors of the harbor. Every mark was a ghost, a silent representative of the men, women, and children who had perished in the hold of the Meridian. The table had become a tombstone for the unburied, a wooden monument to a tragedy that the city had tried to forget. The precision of the count was the most chilling aspect for Constable Rutherford, as it linked the impossible disappearance directly to the secret crime of the spring. It was a mathematical proof of vengeance, a literal accounting for the cargo that the 5 men had dismissed as a financial loss. The tally marks seemed to pulse with an energy of their own, drawing the eye away from the luxury of the club and toward the darkness of the deep sea. There was no tool found in the room that could have created such deep indentations in so short a time, leaving the authorities to wonder whose hand had held the knife. It was as if the table itself had been forced to bear the weight of the truth that the 5 owners could no longer carry. The marks were a physical manifestation of a spiritual debt, a bill of sale written in the wood of the oppressors. The word reckoning acted as a bridge between the physical world of Charleston and the spiritual realm of the victims' ancestors. In the storytelling traditions of the enslaved, a reckoning was not just a punishment, but a restoration of balance to a world made tilted by cruelty. The 5 men had spent their lives tiptoeing around the moral consequences of their wealth, but the table forced them into a final confrontation with the numbers. Each of the 147 marks was a voice that had been silenced by the Atlantic, now speaking through the grain of the mahogany. The carving was a defiant act of reclamation, turning the very site of the planter's business into a shrine of accountability. It stripped away the masks of the gentlemen, and revealed them as debtors to a ledger they could never hope to balance. For those who stood in the room that night, the marks felt like more than just scratches. They felt like a presence that filled the void where the men should have been. The tally marks were crowded together, some overlapping in a frenzy of carving that suggested a deadline had been reached at exactly 9:17 p.m. As the light from the oil lamps flickered, the shadows within the carvings seemed to move, giving the illusion that the marks were still being counted. It was a psychological weapon that broke the resolve of the investigators, making them feel the eyes of the 147 upon them. The mahogany, once a symbol of the men's status and colonial power, had been weaponized against them, turned into a canvas for the very people they had oppressed. The table was no longer a piece of furniture. It was an altar where 5 lives had been traded for the memory of many. The legacy of those 147 marks would haunt Charleston for generations, a reminder that no lock is strong enough to keep out the truth. Even after the Wellington Club was shuttered and the room was sealed, the story of the table whispered through the streets like a persistent fog. It became a symbol of the revenge of the sea, a warning to those who believed they could bury their sins in the deep. The word reckoning remained a jagged scar on the city's history, proving that the silent and the drowned still held the power to demand an answer. The 5 men were gone, but the count remained, a permanent record of a debt that was finally and violently settled in full. The third keynote serves as the heart of the mystery, where the abstract guilt of the planters was given a sharp, wooden reality. In the weeks preceding the grand vanishing, the 5 plantations were gripped by a subtle but pervasive shift in reality. The air on the vast estates, usually heavy with the scent of jasmine and earth, began to carry a metallic chill that no hearth could warm. Guards reported that the livestock grew frantic as the sun dipped below the horizon, huddling together as if sensing a predator that left no scent. On the Hartley estate, the overseer noted that the dogs refused to enter the northern woods, whimpering at unseen shadows that danced between the ancient, moss-draped oaks. It was as if the land itself was rejecting its masters, becoming a hostile landscape that hummed with a low, vibrating tension. This was the beginning of a communal haunting, a slow-motion collapse of the ironclad order these men had spent their lives maintaining. The most unsettling phenomenon was the arrival of the night singers, whose voices drifted across the fields like a spectral tide. Enslaved people on all 5 plantations reported hearing rhythmic, polyphonic chants in languages that had been suppressed for generations. The music did not come from any specific direction. It seemed to rise directly from the soil or fall from the gray, heavy clouds above. On the Foster plantation, the singing was so loud that it rattled the window panes of the manor house, driving William Foster into a state of sleepless frenzy. He was seen pacing his porch with a shotgun, screaming into the darkness for a choir that only he and his workers could hear. The songs were not melodies of sorrow, but declarations of presence, a sonic reclamation of a space that had been stolen. As the night singing intensified, the visual fabric of the plantations began to fray, revealing figures that defied the laws of light. These were the dwellers in the fog, tall, silent silhouettes that stood at the perimeter of the owner's vision. Whenever Hartley or Landry turned their heads to get a clear view, the figures would dissolve back into the mist like smoke. Yet they left physical traces behind, wet footprints of sea-salted mud on expensive rugs and damp handprints on the outside of second-story windows. The owners became prisoners in their own homes, barricading doors and hiring extra men who were equally terrified by the eyes they felt watching them. The shadows were not content with lurking. They were closing the circle, slowly tightening the noose of their presence around the 5 guilty men. The psychological toll on the plantation owners was visible in the frantic, irrational measures they took to secure their safety. Thomas Brennan became obsessed with the locks on his study door, replacing them daily and eventually nailing the shutters closed against the night. He stopped eating, convinced that the water tasted of brine and that the bread was filled with the sand of a distant African shore. Richard Ashby, the man of logic, began to fill his journals with desperate, sprawling script that detailed conversations he claimed to have with the dead. He wrote of 147 visitors who sat in his parlor while his wife slept, their clothes dripping with seawater and their lungs exhaling the smell of the deep. Their paranoia was not a descent into madness, but a forced awakening to a reality they had tried to drown in March. The household staff witnessed the terrifying transformation of their masters into hollowed-out husks of the men they once were. At the Landry estate, the young master was found clawing at the walls of his bedroom, his fingernails bleeding as he tried to dig out the voices he heard behind the plaster. He had surrounded his bed with candles, yet he claimed the room remained pitch black, as if a supernatural darkness was absorbing the light. The servant spoke in hushed tones of how the owner's shadows no longer moved with their bodies, sometimes lingering a moment too long against the wall. There was a sense of impending arrival, a feeling that the debt was no longer being calculated but was now being actively collected. The men were already gone in spirit long before they ever stepped foot into the private chamber of the Wellington Club. On the final night before the disappearance, the phenomena reached a crescendo that terrified even the most hardened of the plantation guards. A thick, unnatural fog rolled inland from the harbor, swallowing the manor houses in a cold, suffocating embrace that silenced all natural sound. The singing stopped, replaced by a rhythmic thudding that sounded like the heavy tread of many feet marching toward the centers of the estates. By dawn, the owners were gone to their final meeting, leaving behind homes that felt like empty shells of a forgotten era. The haunting was not a ghost story meant to frighten, but a spiritual siege that broke the defenses of 5 powerful men. Keynote 4 reveals that the vanishing at the club was merely the final act of a reckoning that had already claimed their souls. The ultimate fate of the 5 men remains one of history's most chilling enigmas because of the absolute physical impossibility of their departure. When Constable Rutherford began his forensic audit of Private Chamber 3, he was searching for a secret that simply did not exist within the architecture of the building. The Wellington Club was a structure of brick and mortar, not magic, yet its physical boundaries had been utterly defied by the 5 plantation owners. Experts in carpentry were brought in to dismantle the heavy mahogany wainscoting, searching for the hollow resonance of a hidden passage or a forgotten servant's stairwell. They found only solid brick and ancient mortar, undisturbed since the building's construction in the late 18th century. The room was a perfect, impenetrable box that offered no rational exit for 5 grown men. The mystery deepened when the focus shifted to the single window, which had long been a point of scrutiny for the local investigators. Multiple layers of thick lead-based paint had sealed the sash into the frame years before the incident, creating a permanent, airtight seal. Rutherford's team used magnifying glasses to inspect the delicate paint chips, confirming that not a single flake had been disturbed or cracked on that fateful night. Had the men attempted to climb out, the brittle seal would have shattered, yet the glass remained intact and the frame remained fused to the wall. This meant the window was not a doorway, but a transparent wall that had watched the men vanish without ever being opened. Even the iron bars on the exterior remained rusted in place, untouched by human hands or the ropes of an escape. The floor and ceiling were subjected to the same relentless search for a structural flaw, but they yielded nothing but silent, unyielding wood and plaster. Beneath the heavy rugs, the floorboards were tightly fitted and nailed with square-cut iron spikes that showed no signs of recent prying or movement. There was no basement access from this section of the club, and the solid ground beneath the joists left no room for a tunnel or a subfloor hideout. Above, the decorative plaster ceiling was a seamless expanse of white, showing no trapdoors or attic access points that could have served as a getaway. The 5 men could not have gone up, and they could not have gone down. They were trapped in a geometry that allowed no escape. It was as if the very dimensions of the room had shifted to allow them to exit through a door that wasn't there. The testimony of the club's porter, Henry Webb, served as the final, insurmountable barrier to any theory of a conventional, physical escape. He had remained at his post in the narrow hallway for the duration of the meeting, never once leaving the only path that led away from the room. Webb was a man of sober habits and keen observation, and he swore under oath that the mahogany door never opened after the lock clicked. He saw no shadows, heard no footsteps, and witnessed no one passing through the corridor until the manager arrived to force the door. If the men had walked out, they would have had to walk through Webb himself, yet he remained the lone guardian of a hallway that led to an empty room. His accounts were consistent across every interview, painting a picture of a night where the laws of physics were simply ignored. The lack of any struggle or signs of violence within the room suggested that the men were not taken by force, but were perhaps surrendered. There were no overturned chairs, no shattered glass, and no blood to indicate that a physical abduction had taken place behind that locked door. The brandy remained in the glasses, and the personal effects remained on the table, as if the owners had simply stepped out of their bodies. This led to a local folklore that suggested the 147 souls of the Meridian had pulled the men into the nothingness between the walls. Without a body to bury or a trail to follow, the legal system was paralyzed, unable to declare a crime or a death. The case was eventually moved to the cold files of Charleston's history, an unsolved anomaly that mocked the certainty of the city's highest authorities. Today, The incident serves as a haunting reminder that some debts are collected in ways that the physical world cannot explain or prevent. The 5 plantation owners were never seen again, not in the bustling streets of Charleston, nor in the distant ports of Europe or the Caribbean. Their estates were eventually sold, their names faded from the social registers, and their empires crumbled into the dust of the Reconstruction era. Yet, the story of the locked room at the Wellington Club persists as a warning to those who believe their power makes them untouchable. It suggests that when the cry for justice is loud enough, even the most solid walls can become as thin as the morning fog. The 5 men thought they were safe behind a mahogany door, but they learned too late that there is no lock for a reckoning.